Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Iron Warriors, their faction rules, and their armory, because they do love a bit of Iron Within and Iron Without. They like both. They're cool with both of them. In this video, we're going to be talking about the faction trait and the advanced reaction, the Warlord Traits, and also the various different weapons that they've got available in their armory. But before we do that, if you enjoy the content, please do like and subscribe on YouTube, and if you've got any feedback or any comments about the episode at all, please do leave them down in the comments below. And with that, on with the show. The Iron Warriors Legion trait is called Rack and Ruin, and what it does is it gives you +1 strength to your attacks, melee and ranged, when targeting vehicles or dreadnoughts, and also buildings and fortifications, which is super thematic. Now, that is pretty huge, because mathematically, even if you're not really into the math side of things, it's just a huge swing, right? You're rolling a d6 on armor penetration or wounding, and you're generally going to be doing one better. That's a big shift in the numbers. And what it means versus vehicles is that a lot of weapons can penetrate things that they couldn't penetrate at all before, or a lot of weapons can glance things they couldn't glance at all before. And versus dreadnoughts, it makes a lot of weapons that previously wounded on a 3 wound them on a 2. So really, this just makes all your weapons much better versus those targets. And what it lets Iron Warriors do is use all their big guns to shoot all the enemy big guns up, get them off the table quickly, and then you can turn all those big guns on smaller targets. A lot of las cannons can clean up a lot of Space Marines quite quickly when they've got nothing else to shoot at. So some examples, this makes las cannons incredibly reliable. Like if you're shooting at a Predator with a las cannon, you're basically going to pen it almost all the time. If you're shooting at things like Spartans or Land Raiders with your las cannons, rather than having a small chance of penetrating or glancing, you're now going up to a much bigger chance. And it also makes autocannons a really good anti-tank weapon as well. Autocannons have got rending, which is great, but their strength's a bit on the low side at 7. Once it bumps up to 8, and you've got that rending and you've got 2 shots, they're actually very good at killing vehicles of any kind, whether they're Predators or Land Raiders or even Spartans. The other cool thing this does is it lets low-strength, high-volume weapons easily glance some light vehicles to death. So, whereas bolters normally can't hurt a Rhino in the front, all of a sudden a unit with bolters can now just machine gun a Rhino and kill it without much issue. And weapons like Volkite culverins, for example, which are a really good anti-infantry weapon, this lets you turn those on a Predator, which is armor 13, which you can now hurt with your strength 7 Volkite culverin. So, as well as making anti-tank weapons better at killing tanks, it makes a lot of non-anti-tank weapons able to hurt targets they previously couldn't. And because those weapons tend to have a very high volume of fire, they can easily glance those vehicles to death, which is a really powerful thing. Now, this also really has a big impact on Power Fist and Thunderhammers as well. So some of these bigger weapons are generally strength 8 when you're doubling your strength 4 Marine. And against dreadnoughts, which is a thing that you commonly have to kill in the game, you wound on a 3. But this makes them wound on a 2, which is really good. And it means that against Leviathan dreadnoughts, you wounded on a 3 instead of a 4. So this is really good. And when you're fighting against vehicles as well, strength 8 again, not always the best thing for killing big vehicles like a Land Raider, but all of a sudden when you go up to strength 9, you can penetrate a Land Raider, so it gives more utility to weapons that don't normally work as well in certain situations, which in some ways is better than making your anti-tank even anti-tankier, making all your other weapons that you normally take for other purposes also able to kill tanks. Adds a lot of variety and a lot of tactical options to your army. I think this is one of the better Legion traits in the game. Although it only applies to some of your opponent's army if they're playing a balanced army, the options it opens up on the table are so good, and I think it's really, really powerful. It's also really thematic, and I really like what this does. Their advanced reaction is called Bitter Fury, and this is effectively a return fire, but you get double shots and your weapons get hot. Wow. Return fire is already pretty good, and it really can kill a lot of stuff if you've got a big unit return of fire. This lets you do it twice, effectively, at the cost of your weapon getting hot. Now, people will need to play around this. People need to play around return fire already, but playing around this, you can imagine you shoot at a unit of 10 las cannons, you get 20 las cannon shots back at you. It's crazy, and people are going to have to play around this a lot, which is going to make their shooting much less efficient against you in general, even if you've not used this reaction, because people are going to be rightly scared of shooting certain units, and they may even not shoot at the unit in the first place because it's too risky to just have whatever they shoot with blow up. Now, it does work extra well with things that aren't las cannons, for example, or melter guns that can't penetrate your armor on get hot rolls. So things like autocannons or plasma guns, or just guns with a lower volume, this is going to work a bit better on because it's not going to be as dangerous to your own marines. So if you shoot Volkite Culverins with this, you're going to roll an awful lot. You're going to be rolling 100 dice with this if you've got a unit of 10 Volkite Culverins, and that's going to be a lot of get hot rolls. And so you definitely don't want that many, and you don't want ones that are AP 3 or 2, depending on what unit you're shooting with, ideally. You know, and for that reason, it also works quite well on Tyrant Siege Terminators, because they've got missile launchers, which are AP 3, but they themselves have got a 2+ save. So if they do get hot, at least you're mostly saving yourself as well. So that's also pretty good. Alternatively, you can just blow your own unit up gloriously. Sometimes you can just ignore the gets hot, throw caution to the wind, and you might just want to take that double shot with one of your units to obliterate whatever's shooting at you. So this is a really powerful reaction. And again, I think it's one of the better reactions in the game, just because it's so powerful. The only thing that stops it from maybe being the best, or, you know, the in running for the best, is the fact that not every army really shoots you very much. Some armies just don't do that much shooting, but it's super, super good when this works. Now, the Iron Warriors Warlord traits, they're all Tyrant of something, which is cool. So the first one is Tyrant of the Apollocron. This makes the Warlord and the unit that he joins fearless, which is very powerful. Fearless making you completely immune to pinning, which is really good. But the drawback is you've got to shoot the closest unit with your shooting every turn. And you've also got to charge the closest unit as well. And this gives you a shooting reaction. Now, that drawback's pretty big. And Fearless is really good, but maybe not as big as the drawback. But overall, this is still a pretty good Warlord trait. You know, a lot of the time, if you're doing this on a shooting unit, the unit will be out of range to charge anyway, so you're not worrying about that. Shooting the closest thing, though, is quite a drawback. So, depending on what you put this on, it might be useful for your army. Tyrant of the Dodecathon. So this picks a terrain piece after people have deployed, and it removes the cover save from that terrain piece, and it makes the piece difficult and dangerous terrain. And again, it's after people are deployed onto the battlefield, so it can be a piece of terrain that people have already put a unit into. Now, that's also pretty good. I've played with traits like this in other games, and sometimes it can do nothing, but sometimes it can be very impactful dependent on what your opponent's playing. And it also gives you a shooting phase reaction, which is quite cool. That means that Iron Warriors are the only legion that have got 2 reactions that give you the same, 2 Warlord traits that give you the same phase reaction. So I think this is pretty good as well. It's also thematic for Iron Warriors too. I think it's worthy of consideration. And then the last one, the big one, is Tyrant of the Lysatra. So this is super interesting. When the Warlord joins an infantry unit, they get +1 shot with their guns. So you get +1 additional dice. You don't shoot twice, just +1 additional dice. And that works with rapid fire assault or heavy weapons, not blast or template weapons. That's very, very powerful. You know, particularly if you think of units that have got low numbers but powerful shots. So, for example, Siege Tyrants, who've got 2 crack missiles, can go up to 3, and they can easily save off to get hot. Or you could put it on, you know, a unit of guys with las cannons, which will kill themselves but get, you know, 2 turns worth of shooting effectively in one go. That's really, really powerful. But this does come with a few drawbacks as well. So the first drawback is having to put your Warlord in the unit. Now, Warlords are generally quite expensive. You know, you're probably paying 125 to 175 points for your Warlord, and most of that points goes into them being good at melee and hard to kill. And if they're sitting in a shooting unit that's, you know, sitting away and blazing away with guns, you're probably not getting the best value out of your Warlord. So that's definitely a cost to using this. The second is that they've got to return fire. They do get a free return fire action, effectively, which is good, but they have got to return fire when they get shot. So this is an upside in one way, because if someone shoots you, you get a free return fire. That's really powerful. But also it makes it quite easy to bait. So, you know, depending on what this unit's doing, your opponent could shoot it with something that is, you know, not affected too much by the type of weapon the unit's got, and then shoot them with something else. So it can actually make it harder for them to defend themselves if your opponent plays around it properly. Now, the other drawback is this unit can't make any other reactions either. So they can't overwatch, they can't brace, they can't move in the movement phase with those ones, and they also can't evade. So they can't do any reactions at all. And this Warlord, importantly, doesn't grant an additional reaction to your army. So that's compensated for by the free return fire a little bit, but obviously nowhere near as good as being able to choose where it goes. So overall, this is potentially very powerful because +1 shot on a lot of units is just a really huge deal. And it does stack with the Bitter Fury trait as well, but you can use them at the same time. It doesn't stack. Bitter Fury lets you shoot twice and then add a dice on top, but that's a lot of shooting potentially if someone tries to shoot this unit. So it can make it quite difficult for anyone to deal with this shooting unit, but the drawbacks are also big. Now, I wouldn't be surprised to see this in lots of armies. I would definitely be using this if I played Iron Warriors, just because despite how positive and negative it is, it's just super cool. But the other Warlord traits, I think the Tyrant of the Apollocron is maybe not so great, just because the drawback of shooting the closest thing is so big, but you may well find uses for Fearless units, particularly if you want to use some kind of melee unit in your Iron Warriors. And Tyrant of the Dodecathon's definitely got some potential impact as well. But again, you've also got the Buck Warlord traits, if you want to go with something that is less bad in the way of drawbacks. You know, you've got Stoic Defender that gives you a shooting reaction like these do, but also makes your unit pin with no drawbacks, which is potentially a good option too. Alright, so on to the Armoury. So we've got Graviton Crushers. This is the Graviton class of melee weapons that Iron Warriors use. So first we've got the Graviton Mace. So this is a power mace. It replaces the power mace for free. It's effectively -2 strength and haywire. So it strikes a strength user, but it gains haywire. This is pretty good. If you're going to have a unit of men running around the battlefield, being able to have a sergeant carrying one of these, which will have, 3 attacks on the charge, just a normal tactical marine sergeant, 3 attacks on the charge, have a haywire weapon, is good. That's being able to put a couple of glances or a couple of wounds on a dreadnought or something like that, just for the cost of a power weapon on a sergeant in a tactical squad, is great. And when you multiply that up by other units that could use it potentially, this is quite a powerful weapon, definitely something you can find uses for in your army for a low cost to add another way of threatening those bigger targets. Then we've got the Graviton Crusher. So this one's maybe not so good. So this is +2 strength as opposed to ×2 strength for a Thunder Hammer. So it replaces a Thunder Hammer, which effectively means it's -2 strength compared to a Thunder Hammer, but it does gain haywire. It loses Brutal, though, and as most of you will know, Brutal is probably one of the best rules in the game for doing damage to things and killing things. So what you're losing effectively is instant death, because Strength 6 won't instant death most things. You're also losing Brutal to gain haywire. Now, rarely a Thunder Hammer with Strength 8 and Brutal is actually better against Dreadnoughts than this is, because you can do 2 damage to a Dreadnought, although you're only wounding them a 3, whereas haywire effectively wounds on a 2. You're getting 2 goes at it, which makes a normal Thunder Hammer do more damage versus a Dreadnought. And also, as well, it makes you worse versus other targets. So when you're fighting other things in melee, which will happen in the game, you've lost the abilities of a Thunder Hammer against targets that don't suffer from haywire as well. So overall, this is not really worth losing the 2 strength and the Brutal to be a bit better versus vehicles, which is the only thing that this does improve. Strength 8 can be quite hard to hurt something like a Land Raider. You're going to do very little to a Land Raider. Brutal doesn't do anything. So haywire is better in that situation, but it's a bit of a niche situation, and your whole army is good at killing vehicles. So, whilst the Thunder Hammer would get the job done, the Graviton Crusher will be better at that, but it's just not worth being worse against the other targets, I don't think. So if you want to take one of these for coolness factor, for modelling potential and that kind of stuff, certainly do. It's not awful or anything like that, but it's maybe just a little bit of a downgrade, which is a bit of a shame, because we really want to see these weapons being an upgrade of some kind most of the time. And then last, we've got the Graviton Maul. So this is an interesting one. This replaces Gravis Fists for Dreadnoughts, basically. and it loses 1 point of Brutal, but it gains Haywire. Now, Brutal and Haywire do stack. I went back and forth on this rule for a little while before coming out at what I think is the correct rule, and it's actually pretty obvious when you read it properly. Haywire replaces your wound roll. So as long as you're hitting a target that Haywire affects, like a Dreadnought, then you do get the effects of Haywire and Brutal at the same time. But ultimately, it's probably not worth doing that as well, much like with the Graviton Crusher, because if you did hit a Dreadnought with a Brutal 3 weapon, you've got 3 goes at wounding it. By taking Brutal 2 Haywire, you've actually only got 2 goes at wounding it, and you probably were going to wound it on a 2 anyway because of Rack and Ruin with your fist. It obviously, again, is probably better versus vehicles because Haywire just makes you more likely to wound them, but Dreadnoughts have got the option for Gravis Chain Fists, which is even better again. And this is really expensive. This actually costs 15 points. It's not free. So for 10 points, you could take a Gravis Chain Fist, which is going to penetrate every time, as opposed to just make a Haywire roll. So this is not a good weapon for a Dreadnought at all. It's a significant downgrade, which is a little bit of a shame. But for units that don't replace a Dreadnought weapon, like Iron Circle, this is a pretty cool weapon to have. You know, it's Brutal 2, it's Haywire, it's got good strength. It is a decent weapon, it's just not worth taking on the Dreadnoughts, really. Again, unless you want to do it for the modelling opportunity, in which case it is a downgrade, which is a little bit of a shame, but it's not awful. It's not like you're going to hate using it. It could just be a little bit better. And then we've also got the other hallmark of the Iron Warriors, which is Shrapnel Weapons. So generally, these replace bolters of various kinds. You lose a few inches of range. So the bolter is 18, for example, and you generally lose about 2 armor penetration. So the bolter has no armor penetration. The heavy bolters go to 6, which is, against Space Marines, kind of irrelevant because they didn't penetrate anything anyway, but might be relevant against other armies in the future, losing that pennon. But you gain pinning on every gun, which is a really big deal. It costs 2 points per model, which is pretty cheap. You know, it does add up across a whole unit, but it is pretty cheap, and you do have to replace every gun in the unit. Or 5 points for the Gravis Shrapnel Cannon. Now, pinning is so powerful as a mechanic that mass access to it for an army is very good. You know, every tactical squad in your army coming with pinning guns is really good. But the other way you can use this, as well as putting it on units of Marines, you can just get them in anywhere you can in your army. You know, you only need 1 failed save to force a pin and roll, so even one guy with a shrapnel bolter in a unit can suddenly turn that unit into a potential pin. So characters with bolt weapons that are going to join other units that maybe don't have pinning themselves, or pinning themselves, I'm going to keep getting these 2 words mixed up, or just saving the points on a tactical squad by not giving them shrapnel bolters because they've got a character with a pinning capable weapon. Pinnacle mounted heavy bolters on vehicles is a really good tip for these. So if you can take a pinnacle mounted heavy bolter on a vehicle, normally you might not do that because they're a bit expensive and not very good. But in Iron Warriors, every vehicle can have a pinnacle mounted pinning heavy bolter, and it's a defensive weapon. So even if that vehicle is packing some las cannons or something like that, they can still just shoot some random pinning shots off against the closest infantry unit, which is really great. Just throwing out potential pins all over the battlefield will have a good effect. And also rhinos as well, similarly with a heavy bolter on top, lets you do this too for quite cheap. You know, it's a little mobile pinning machine. So overall, really great thing for Iron Warriors to do, very thematic and gives you access to something quite powerful. So lastly in the army, we've got the Warsmith. So he gains a servo arm and battlesmith 3+ for 20 points, which is pretty okay. That's a pretty decent upgrade for your Praetor, and it means that you get access to some nice stuff for not too many points. Now he also comes with the Master of Automata and Cortex Controller rules as well, which is probably going to make this a very good upgrade if you want to use robots in your army when they get rules, and especially if the robots are good, because for 20 points it's quite a low cost to get a servo arm, which is extra attack, battlesmith 3+, which is a nice thing to have when it's not too expensive, and also another Cortex controller on the board as well, assuming that that's important for robots when we see the rules. So this is a pretty good upgrade, does a fair bit for not too many points, and of course is thematic for the Iron Warriors, and because you want to take it, having it be nice and cheap is really good. In summary, the Iron Warriors have got an excellent Legion trait, applicable in almost every game that you play, and very powerful when it's in use. A fantastic advanced reaction that lets you do some really scary things with shooting units in return and fire. Warlord traits that build on shooting even further. Maybe not the best Warlord traits, but they do certainly play into the theme of what Iron Warriors want to do. Mass pinning's also very powerful, especially because you're a shooting heavy army. It gives you a way to defend your guns, to stop people getting to your guns while those guns take the toll on the enemy without needing to bring your own melee units. So your units that are defending your range units can pin enemy units whilst contributing to your shooting without having to bring your own sort of line things to defend them, which is also really good for army building. Now, you are pushed very heavily in one direction, but it's a very thematic direction for the Iron Warriors, and what a great payoff of all this stuff coming together and making the Legion do what it feels like it should do, whilst also being very powerful at the same time. And with that, we're at the end of the episode. I hope all you Iron Warriors players out there, and maybe some other players as well, enjoyed listening to this. I know Iron Warriors are probably the most popular Legion, at least in my opinion, in the game, so hopefully you guys like this video. If you did like it, please do leave me a like and subscribe, and if you've got any comments or any feedback about the episode, please do leave them in the comments down below on YouTube. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.